Thanks very much. Welcome everyone to this hybrid session on water security for climate resilience, how research can support action for COP26 and beyond. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping messages to ask those of you who are here in person to kindly wear your masks during the event so that we can all feel safe and protected. And for those of you online, to please get your microphones and videos turned off during the event, and you can post a question via the Ask a Question function at the bottom of the screen. So firstly, thanks very much to the Oxford Martin School for hosting this event and hosting it as a hybrid. We're excited to be able to bring together our team internationally to help share the research we've been working on. The IPCC's sixth assessment report highlighted that climate change is intensifying the water cycle. We're expecting more floods. Many areas will have more frequent, more severe droughts. We're expecting heavy rainfall to increase and the onset of rainy seasons to become more variable. All of this creates a challenge in terms of water management. It affects all the different ways we use water, and we need to manage it differently. And this is why water security, improving water security, sustaining water security is so critical to achieving climate resilience. And that includes thinking about water security in terms of how much water people have, how reliably they have it, what quality it is for all different types of uses, from drinking water, agricultural use, energy production. And of course, making sure people are protected in terms of water-related risk from floods and from droughts. So tonight, what we're presenting is some of the work we've put into this report, the Water Security for Climate Resilience report. And that's a synthesis of research from 6 years of the REACH program. REACH is funded by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and it aims to improve drinking water security, or aims to improve water security for 10 million people in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And in particular, the countries where our research is focused is Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And across our team, we have roughly 100 researchers working around the world on these challenges and have been working for 6 years. So it's a very interdisciplinary approach that brings together climate scientists, hydrologists, engineers, and social scientists of different types so that we can understand water security from those different scales, from thinking about it from those climate scales, thinking about how it affects that water cycle, and then thinking about how humans interact with that and the policies we need to improve water security. In tonight's program, I'm going to briefly introduce the report, and then we're going to go to scientific presentations from Professor Salehin Mashfiqus in Bangladesh at the Bangladesh University of Engineering Technology, who will share some of Bangladesh's challenges. Professor Seyfu Kebede at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who will share some of Ethiopia's challenges, and then Dr. Marina Kozanevica from the University of Oxford, who's going to talk a bit about the Kenyan context and some of her work there. I'll then hand over to Anna Murgatroyd, who helped lead the report with me, and she will introduce the recommendations and take us into a panel session where you'll hear from myself and Anna, and also Dr. Ellen Dyer, who is a climate scientist. And then we will open up for questions at that point. We are hoping to have closing comments from Dan Yeo, but unfortunately we're having trouble with his stream, so we may not be able to reach him at that point, but we hope that will be sorted. So firstly, as we come to the report, as I mentioned, this is a synthesis of research across different disciplines, all focused on water security and how we can improve, how important it is to improve water security for climate resilience. What I'm going to take you through is just a few of the key points from the report to give an outline of it ahead of those detailed presentations. Firstly, I wanted to highlight that the REACH approach is very much an interdisciplinary approach. building, as I mentioned, on skills from scientists working in very different fields. And with it, we bring a politicized approach to building climate resilience, or advocate for that certainly, to consider these different issues of not just thinking about resilience in terms of, say, infrastructure and the management of the water systems, but very much thinking about how we are improving water security and thinking about improvements of what, to what, for whom, and then thinking about issues at scale, both spatial and temporal scales, and then thinking about the politics of by whom is leading some of this work and making these decisions about water security, and how does that influence the inequalities that are embedded in water security. So I wanted to highlight 3 points from the research, and each of these I'll present a brief case study from the research. So inequalities exacerbate the impacts of climate shocks. This is an example from across the Awash Basin. So I'm going to focus at the spatial scale. So at the upper Awash, you have much more rainfall reliable area down to very arid areas at the bottom end in Ethiopia. And so what people's experiences of water security and people's climate resilience varies a lot across that basin then, based on these different climate zones. At the top of the basin, in the more moisture reliable areas, we see some flooding, some expected flooding, but also some flooding that's occasional, unexpected, and some areas potential for drought in some occasional years. As you move down the basin, people have different challenges. Those flooding challenges are increasing, whereas water scarcity is becoming more of a challenge. And as you move to the far end of the basin, to that very arid area, you end up with severe water scarcity, particularly in specific months. And this is highlighted against a calendar, pointing out that June is a particular month, because I'll come back to that in later slides. So we see, like, across a basin, which is often a unit we would use for analysis of water security, you've got a very different situation. Within those communities further, you end up with inequalities which will further exacerbate the impacts of those shocks that they're facing. And that's something that Marina's going to pick up more in her presentation with some more of the context from Kenya. Water systems are not just the engineered systems, but they're socio-environmental systems. And they have, because of this, they have complex vulnerabilities to climate. This is an example of a photo from Bangladesh, where the river is not that colour because of a filter, the river is that colour because of the pollution. So this is garment industry, textile dyeing waste that is changing the colour of that river. And so this is particularly in the dry season. If we look at the seasonality in this system, we see that towards the centre of these graphs is the wet season, where the depth is higher of the water, turbidity is high, and a lot of the pollutants are quite low. So ammonia, nitrate, phosphate are all very low during this period. If you look then at the edges of the graphs during the drier period, you're getting much higher concentrations of these pollutants. With climate change, if we're seeing longer dry periods, if we're seeing later onsets of rain, there's going to be more pressure on these systems in terms of longer periods of contamination. And that has big implications for those ecosystems, but also for the people who rely on it. We know in Bangladesh that there are communities who are relying on this water regularly for washing, for bathing, and so they are exposed to those very high levels of concentration you saw in that, of contaminants you saw in that photo before. And thirdly, climate information must be accurate, locally adapted, and accessible to water managers. Here are some graphs of Ethiopia. So we have the average annual rainfall on the left and the rainfall zones on the right. And so you can see from the ones on the left that we have rainy, dry lands are the darker colours, and the yellow is the more moisture reliable, the higher rainfall areas. And if you can see the cursor, this is the Awash River Basin that we focus our research on, going from those high rainfall areas to those very arid areas. But it's not enough just to have those averages. The climate varies quite a lot, especially in Ethiopia, because it's got quite complex topography. You have quite a variable climate. And so water managers need to have data that's relevant to them. On this side, we highlight the rainfall zones, highlights those in the red, have more of a single rainfall season, whereas those in the blue and purple, you've got two distinct rainy seasons with a particularly dry June in the middle. And that becomes very important to the water managers because it has big implications, as you saw previously, for what people are experiencing, when they're most vulnerable. If we look at the models though, here on the dashed lines is the data from observations of rainfall, whereas the solid lines are different models of rainfall for this, focus on the left on the Awash Basin. And you can see that those models aren't replicating the pattern of rainfall that we're seeing very well in that area. So these are the global climate models. And so they're missing that particular signal when we're seeing a lot of vulnerability in this basin. So we need more accurate models that are able to replicate these conditions and also to be available on a scale where they're useful for water managers. So for these water managers in the Awash Basin, they need models that are working at the scales that are relevant for their climate zone and for their area of operations, for where, for example, their recharge zone for the groundwater they're using. So those are the areas where I wanted to highlight initially from the report to give some overview of three of the areas that we focused on. We're now going to go to, first we'll go to Ethiopia, then to Professor Seifu Kebede from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who's been working on particular hydrogeology in Ethiopia and looking at climate resilience within those systems in Ethiopia. So we have a pre for this one, so we don't have technical difficulties.
Hello, good morning. My name is Seifu Kebede Gumesa. I'm from University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, member of REACH team. I'll talk about groundwater in Ethiopia and under climate change. And groundwater has some unique features compared to other water resources. It is available where it is needed, and it is our largest reservoir of fresh water resources globally. And it is also untapped resource in a sense that large volume of saline and brackish water is yet to be utilized, and then it is naturally protected. And these features of groundwater make it a strategic resource to combat against the climate change and climate variability, including natural changes or natural variability, such as seasonality. And in countries like Ethiopia, groundwater has many other services, particularly related to climate-induced or other emergencies. And it serves as water sourcing during droughts and flood hazard emergencies, for refugee camps, for internally displaced people, and even during armed conflicts, serves as sources of water. And also there is a big scope in Africa for the use of groundwater for food production if used conjunctively with surface water. And globally, up to 40% of food is produced, for instance, in the US using groundwater-based agriculture or development. And then groundwater has service in also buffering seasonality, not just droughts and climate change, but seasonality in water availability is a critical challenge in rural Africa. Water availability in drilled wells is generally stable across seasons and can serve as sources of water during this period. And if you see this seasonal seasons and water availability and what source of water people use across different seasons and the waiting time or the collection, the time it takes them to collect water, you see that during wet seasons, like in June, July, August, and September, people rely on locally available water sources like ponds and seasonal pools. There are many reasons for choosing these sources: cost, availability, distance, waiting time, etc. And then during the dry seasons, people rely on waterways. And if you see also disease calendar, how diseases change seasonally, you see most of the diseases like acute watery diarrhea and diarrheal diseases occurring during when people rely on ponds and seasonal pools. So you see that the benefit of using boreholes, regardless of the longer waiting time, is also it overcomes the challenges of disease burden people would carry. And groundwater is available everywhere, but may not be within accessible depths, distance, or quality, water quality, leaving certain areas water insecure compared to other areas. So this map you see here is water availability during drought season for different districts in Ethiopia. In red means these areas are really struggling. Most of the boreholes are newly drilled boreholes in this region or similar region in adjacent countries like Somalia and Kenya are unsuccessful. In some instances, up to 90% of drilled boreholes are unsuccessful. In other instances, up to 30% are unsuccessful. So unsuccessful boreholes due to dryness or turning dry or saline is very common in these environments. It's not only that in arid environments we have these problems, even in humid highlands, if you see individual water schemes, you see that some water schemes in red here do not have sufficient catchments and sufficient aquifer storage to sustain flow during dry seasons. And the green ones are where you have sufficient storage in the catchment and in the aquifers to sustain flow during dry seasons. And even in the highland environments, there are schemes that struggle to provide water during dry season, particularly the shallow ones, the shallow hand-dug wells and shallow drilled boreholes. And functionality is also an issue. Functionality, if you look into this functionality figure, only 35% of boreholes equipped with hand pumps are functional. When you say functional in this instance, in this sense, means there is flowing water, sufficient, good quality, and continuously uninterrupted. But if you account for all this water quality and interruption, and sufficient yield, only 35% are functional. This is a big issue in the region, not only in Ethiopia, but in other parts of Africa as well. And then what are we doing under the REACH program? There are a number of groundwater-related research, groundwater and water quality-related research, and one of which is on deciphering or understanding the relation between sustainable land management and groundwater storage or groundwater recharge. You see here sustainable land management, terracing, etc. And then we looked into how this benefits groundwater storage. We see some good link between groundwater recharge and this kind of interventions, and mapping strategic aquifers in difficult hydrogeology environments, the environment I've shown you where boreholes fail to provide good quality water or turn dry, identification of strategic aquifers for protection and for sustainable use, and then also in some regions, in Upper Awash, for instance, where most of the industries and the population is congregating, we have large gap between demand and supply, and then this demand and supply gap in the future can be reduced if groundwater and surface water can be conjunctively used. Even then, we see that the demand will never be met by surface water and groundwater combined use. We need to bring in other mechanisms like managed aquifer recharge and wastewater reuse, etc. And thank you very much.
So we'll come back to Marina Kozenovica, who's going to share with us her work from Lodwar in Kenya.
Hello, everybody. I would present research in Lateral that has been already happening for a couple of years, many people involved, and we did mainly qualitative research. A bit about the context. Turkana is the poorest county in Kenya, and it's the respondents specifically in Lateral, they ranged from poor to extremely poor, and hunger has been usually considered as the main concern by people. Lateral is a small town between two rivers. One of them is perennial, the other one is not. And it's very prone to flash floods. One of the reasons is that the rivers just break the banks, but also the heavy rainfall can cause flash floods. Moreover, one of the rivers, Colas, which is on the top, is diverting, which means that slowly, year by year, it's encroaching the town. Nevertheless, Lateral is also experiencing a very high urbanization rates. One of the reasons is because traditionally Turkana people are pastoralists, and due to droughts, they flee to Lateral in search of the rivers for the livestock, but also economic opportunities. Other reasons for migration is also ethnic violence, electoral violence, and just search for economic opportunities in the town. Migration is a common topic and is very frequently mentioned, particularly with climate change, but usually it's about movements from place A to B, whereas I would like to draw your attention to multidimensional aspect of it. Just a few examples. How is it happening through generations? For instance, drought. In one case, a woman who is 24, her parents migrated from a small place in Turkana to firstly to Calico, next to the lake where they were doing the fishing, which is considered the socially lowest possible income generation by pastoralists. And the family grew poorer and poorer from a rich, wealthy pastoralist family. Eventually, woman needed to move to Lateral and become a housemaid. And after some years, she moved her family with her. And mobility can be partial. For instance, Red Cross is frequently facilitating movements of people from flood-prone zones towards safety. And one of the beneficiaries considered old widows because they're one of the most vulnerable. However, they perceive it's very difficult, the movement. So they frequently give this land to, the land that they have received, they give this land to the family of their sons. And it is a very common phenomena, and yet when we talk to locals, they say that the gods will curse the son who has left his mother in the flood zone, but it is happening. And finally, social mobility. It is when physical mobility is associated, accompanied with the social mobility, and usually, of course, it's aspired with the upward social mobility. One example, one man, he wanted to start a rental business. However, due to floods, all the rental properties were swept away and his usual income generation activity was also destroyed. So now he has started gravel collection, which poses a serious health risks for himself. So I would like to move from the mainstream in what, noting what is happening, towards why. Why is it happening? What are the power relations and gender norms? And how is it experienced? And how is it as in a daily life and by different members of the society? Now a quick description of specific case of the movement from Napetet, which is extremely flood-prone zone, to Lokaparpare. And what it means in practice. In the new place, water is available only from river wells, and it's really a several-hour trip. It means living in the geographical outskirts, far from the market, usual places where you can sell vegetables or customers. And you maneuver the help through different corruption circles and power cliques when you try to get the land, when you try to move. And constant worries about floods and land grabbing. If you don't move fast enough, your land will be grabbed. And one excerpt of the case study, one juror, a woman, 35, she could not continue with her previous vegetable vending after the relocation. She tried, but there were simply no customers. She even initiated illegal alcohol selling, which is the most humiliating, frequently persecuted business, and it's illegal. But her husband asked her to stop, so he does not get tempted. Her husband's motorbike income is going really well, and unlike other families, they don't sleep on empty stomachs. So in this example, we see that the water security due to relocation is growing, particularly for Banjira, who needs to collect multiple times a day water. Mobility for husband is increasing, but for Banjira, she becomes really immobile and stuck in her place. And gender inequality is on the rise because Banjira doesn't have her personal income. And the family's precarity is also on the rise because now they depend on one's insecure income, and the precarity of income is tremendous in the area. And her personal vulnerability is also on the rise because separation and divorces are very common and women's rights are very low. So if something happens, she will have no income source. Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Marina, for that. And we'll hopefully have a chance to hear from Marina a little bit more before we move on to questions. Okay, we're going to try Salahin one more time.
Okay, now I can see the screen. So I hope Katrina has introduced me to the audience. If she hasn't, my name is Mashfiqus Salihin. I'm from Bangladesh, meaning that I'm a little nervous because tomorrow there's an important T20 cricket match coming up between England and Bangladesh. So we're hoping that Bangladesh will beat England tomorrow. So having our fingers crossed. So in contrast to a number of disasters and hazards that beset the coastal zone of Bangladesh, for example, cyclonic storm surge, pluvio-tidal flooding, erosion, and monsoonal flooding, and salinity in groundwater, soil, and river is a creeping hazard, which like other disaster and hazard, has a similar vulnerability to climate change and sea level rise, in that with increasing sea level rise and reduction in freshwater flow, there is every chance that that the salinity levels in all the three systems will increase in the future. So I'll be mostly concentrating on the groundwater salinity aspects in Bangladesh, and basically the kind of stress people have been facing in the coastal area and how it may change in the future in response to changing climate or sea level rise. Next slide, please. So Bangladesh has made a remarkable progress in providing universal access to improved water sources, meaning meeting the MDG targets, thanks to widespread groundwater availability. You can see in the figure, about 87% people have been brought under the coverage of improved sources. But when it comes to SDG delivery, the figure is much lower, well below 50%, because the SDG factors are more stringent in terms of safety of the water, the universal and equitable access, affordability, and reliability. So next slide, please. So the hydrogeology in general in Bangladesh is quite complex, and it's much more complex in the coastal setting. The aquifers are very rarely very stratified, and in many places aquifers are not of adequate thickness, especially in extreme south. So this has a bearing of availability of groundwater in many places in the coastal area, even if the water quality is relatively better than other places. Next slide. So groundwater in the coastal zone is, suffers from a number of water quality constraints. We are all familiar with the arsenic problems in shallow aquifer in Bangladesh, but salinity is found more important in the extreme southern coastal area, even when it's compared to the arsenic problems. So salinity problem is there in the first aquifer as well as in the second and third aquifer, while arsenic problem is mostly found in the first aquifer. The manganese problem, which the Bangladesh government has been putting some emphasis on in recent times, so that problem is seen to be present mostly in the first aquifer, but not much in the second and third aquifer. Iron is a problem in all aquifers, but mostly in the first aquifer. Next slide, please. So highly saline shallow aquifers, but the problem is the salinity variation is highly heterogeneous. So it can vary over very short distances because of the complex, hydrogeology that I have just talked about. And there are some, patches of freshwater pockets in the first, especially in the first aquifer, because of, flushing out of salts by rainfall. Otherwise, the salinity limits the shallow groundwater use. And if you see in the second aquifer, there are some areas in the south central, meaning the areas to the right of the diagrams, so where we have some freshwater zone, but there are problems with very thick aquated layers, meaning that even if the water is available, they are available at a much deeper depths. Next slide, please. So with all these problems with groundwater, still groundwater is the main source of potable water, or 90% of drinking water is derived from tube wells. In Bangladesh, if there, an estimate says there are 1 million public tube wells, whereas 10 million tube wells are there installed, privately. So what we found in our rich research work, the tube well has grown over the last like 2-3 decades in an exponential way. And the growth has been seen both with the deep tube wells, which is, arguably more safer in terms of salinity, but we have also seen exponential growth, with the shallow tube wells, especially in areas where there are no choices or alternatives for people, but to use shallow aquifer. So in those places, people are either forced to drink saline water in absence of any alternative sources, while in other areas, many people are also unknowingly drinking saline water. Next slide, please. So in our study, we find that the national estimates, they don't give us the complete picture. So even if we get the coverage, of people by the improved sources, meaning tube wells, but when we measure the salinity in each and every tube well in our study area, we find that the effective coverage goes down substantially. So which is, evident from this figure. Next slide, please. Next. And next. So, so people in the coastal area, they're already stressed with water quality problems, especially salinity in coastal in the aquifers. But in the government policies, mostly so far we have considered arsenic and E. coli as major contaminants, and we haven't really included salinity as a major contaminant, in any of our national policies or in any survey schemes. So, but what we find that in about like more than 40% deep tube well users were drinking, water with salinity level above the standard limit, and more than 80% of shallow tube wells used by the people were, had salinity above the standard level. So, so this salinity problem may very well be aggravated in the future, and there are multiple ways. The salinity risk can increase in the future. So one possible mechanism is the lateral movement of the seawater interface. So we had found in our previous study is, as a very slow process. There is the other mechanism, which is river aquifer interaction. If the saline water, river water is saline, which is in our coastal area, so with this, exchange between river and aquifer, so there is a big risk of the shallow water in the upper aquifer getting more salinized in the future with increasing river salinity. And this river salinity can increase as a result of sea level rise, as well as any possible reduction of freshwater flow during dry season, which may result from climate change, changes in patterns of precipitation or any anthropogenic interferences like increased abstraction in upstream basins. So this is another mechanism. The other two mechanisms are cyclonic storm surge flooding, and which can inundate areas and can cause salinization in groundwater for some period before they can be washed out. But then there is another source, brackish shrimp aquaculture farming in the coastal area, which has been very common in Bangladesh for the last 20 years. Next slide, please. So what we did was we in our study site, which is a small area in the southwest coastal zone, Boulder 29. Next slide, please, Alice. So we basically did some simulation with a groundwater variable density groundwater model, CWAT, with different aquifer systems, and with extensive measured salinity data, giving the initial condition and and after doing the calibration and validation. So what we find that next slide, please, Alice. So what we find that the drinking water supplies in the areas served by the shallow tube wells, that means the areas in the south of this study site, can be impacted in the future. And we find that lateral movement of seawater interface, that is a very slow process, but increase in river salinity, for example, a 100% increase in river salinity may induce a change of groundwater salinity by 10 to 20%. So depending on, of course, distance from the river to the area we are talking in the shallow aquifer. So this is a very potential source of future groundwater salinization. Although the process is very small, and the impact of sea level rise alone may not be that much, but if it's combined with reduction of freshwater flow from upstream, there can very well be a big reduction in freshwater flow, and with increased sea level, the river salinity can go up substantially, meaning that groundwater may very well be salinized. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of the entire southwest coastal zone. So you can see, on the left, the river salinity, the baseline case, and a projected river salinity in 2050. So with the sea level rise scenario and a socioeconomic scenario, meaning upstream reduction of freshwater flow. And you can see, so we expect river salinity to increase in both the southwestern area, but much more so in the south central region. So what it means is, so more and more areas, there may be more and more areas where fresh groundwater may get newly salinized. So one important policy implication is, so future interventions should target reduction of river salinity, and there is one important way we can achieve that is through increasing the freshwater flow, and that we have been talking about in the policy circle in Bangladesh for a long time, how we can increase the freshwater flow up from upstream in the dry season, and we have been talking about different types of interventions. So this river salinity does not have an impact only on groundwater salinity, but also on soil salinity. So increasing freshwater flow will have a lot of positive implications, and in terms of combating climate change and sea level rise. So I'll stop there. Thank you, and my apologies for the interruptions.
Particular there, they were highlighting that the challenge of finding access to reliable water sources in Ethiopia, and we know there are big challenges coming up in terms of, for example, maintaining water access in Addis Ababa, which is based at the top of the basin and is running out of water. And we also see these interactions between the growing urban demand and industrialization, creating challenges for managing that water going forward. We've seen from Professor Salahin how sea level rise is further exacerbating their challenge of finding safe water. So they have plenty of water in contrast to Ethiopia. What they're finding is salinity is a major challenge, and sea level rise is a big driver of that. And then also from Marina, we heard about the challenges people face when they are exposed to these climate extremes. And so what some of these situations we're seeing in Ethiopia and Bangladesh are also causing the disruption to people's lives, the need for people to adapt and making big changes to cope with these stresses. So I'll now hand over to Anna, who will introduce our recommendations and lead us onto the panel discussion.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna Murgatroyd. I'm a research associate at the School of Geography, and I worked with Katrina and the REACH team to write this report. So I was fortunate enough to read through a lot of REACH research over the last 6 years and try and synthesize it into this report that you see here today. And in reading all of that research, we found that climate and water risks are experienced unequally. The risks have complex physical, political, social, behavioral, and environmental mechanisms. And these risks can influence water security in both urban, peri-urban, and rural communities. But despite this report reveals that dominant policy discourse at the moment on climate resilience fails to address these context-specific issues, and also the distributional impacts of climate events on both water security at the human scale and at larger system scales. And because of this, we've identified 3 recommendations that you can see here. And these recommendations are designed to improve the security of the most vulnerable water systems and increase resilience to both existing and future climate risks. So the first recommendation states that more accurate and granular analysis of climate risks is crucial to increase the relevance of climate information. And so within this research, we found that actually some individual models, as Katrina highlighted, better represent weather systems and climate systems in specific geographies. Likewise, we found that better representation of topological features and subseasonal processes are also key for representation of climate processes. And finally, that the climate information produced from these models needs to be targeted to build resilience for specific climate users. Our second recommendation states that metrics for monitoring climate resilience for water systems are critical to track the progress and inform investments for water security. So we need to understand the scale of climate impacts, both temporally and spatially, on water systems, and look at both the quality and the quantity of water, as these can change throughout the year. Likewise, we need advances in tracking water quality, both for reliability reasons and also because behavioural responses change to different climate events. Finally, our third recommendation calls for new institutional models which aim to improve water security. And this is going to be critical for climate resilience. So these new models need to address the complex ways that climate, water systems, and behaviours interact. They must target and support the most vulnerable, so those most vulnerable to climate change and existing climate risks. They must recognise that behaviour of water use changes with seasons, and likewise the affordability of water changes throughout the year. So these institutional models need to reflect that change. And finally, we need to recognise that climate change is absolutely affecting water usage and payment behaviours. And so with those 3 recommendations in line, I'd like to invite Katrina back up to the stage. Katrina probably doesn't need any introduction, but her research focuses on environmental health risks and she's leading work on both water quality and climate resilience with the aim to progress towards SDG 6.1. And secondly, I'd like to invite Dr. Ellen Dyer, who's a research associate in African climate processes with a focus on East Africa. I think we're just going to turn the screen off now. Okay, great. So this is the start of our panel discussion, and I'd like to open it up by asking Ellen to reflect on the recommendations that we've just stated and give your thoughts related to your research.
Yeah, so I'm going to reflect on recommendation 1, and this highlights the need to have a few simultaneous goals and timelines to have better climate information that's more accurate and responds better to the risks of water systems. So the first is that we do need to have improved tools, and this is definitely sort of a long timeline goal. We need to do more model evaluation on models for Africa specifically. The reason is twofold. The first is that when you do model evaluation, hopefully this feeds back into model development and improvement. And this process is definitely sort of lagging in Africa compared to other regions where it's sort of built into the model development process. And the second is that when you do model evaluation, you're better able to understand what models do well and what they're bad at, so that you can have a realistic approach to using this information in whatever context you're looking at. So for water systems in this case. The second, which we can do concurrently, is understand key climate processes at this point. So we can do that with information that is already available to us, but also we can add to that information with novel observational studies. And this is one thing that REACH has done, a project called RIFJET, where with the University of Nairobi and Kenya Met Department, we did a radio sound campaign, so measuring winds in the Turkana Channel. And the Turkana Jet is really an important climate feature in Kenya, and this connects to Marina's work as well, in particular in Lodwar and that region. But the other thing is that we can do a lot to understand the climate that we're interested in with information that's already available. So it's really important to understand different teleconnections and how different regions sort of influence each other's climate. And this is really important because we can sort of gain a little bit of insight into how one region will change in the future based on its connection to another region. And the other thing is that it's really a good reminder to, in this case in particular, not rely too much on generalizations. So one of the pieces of work that's in this report is led by Dr. Maronte. And in this, we looked at the Awash Basin and different drivers of seasonal rainfall variability. And even within the basin, so the north and the upper and lower basin, they actually had different drivers at a subseasonal scale. So that's sort of adding more information to what we know about climate on a scale that's more related to water systems. And then the third, that's really important and is something that we can do right now, is improve climate communication and use the information that we already have. So we just need to do better at using what is available to us now. So we critique climate information a lot, which is right and good. But there's also a lot of available information that does a reasonable job. But to use this well, we have to improve communication between people who create climate information, who use climate information, and understand how it's shared much better. Yeah, so we need to foster better communication between sectors. So I said creators and users, but we need to understand who those different groups are and see it as an opportunity for collaboration rather than a pipeline of information. And a great way to do this is by learning how people are using climate information now. And we've been doing this with seasonal forecast information in the Awash Basin again, and also in the Turkwell River Basin with a project led by Penny, who's from the Oxford Water Network. And we've been mapping how information flows from people who are creating it, people who are using it, and how it kind of continues in the cycle, and also trying to understand who is left out of this process and where there are gaps or barriers to sharing information. So these three different timelines and sets of goals, if we do them kind of concurrently, we can try to use climate information a bit more efficiently and inclusively, hopefully. So that's sort of my reflection on recommendation 1.
Thanks, Ellen. That's a great summary of what is a lot of work on climate. So I'd like to ask Katrina the same question. Could you provide your reflections on the recommendations and highlight what you think is important?
Yeah, so I was going to focus on the second recommendation, and particularly on drinking water systems, because that's where my interest is. And so in terms of achieving climate resilience in drinking water systems, we need a good level of communication between those models that Ellen's talking about, and understanding of that climate information so that it can be used in those systems, and then also understanding of how that's impacting the water resources as well, so that we can make sure that these systems are able to provide appropriate levels of quantities of water and of an appropriate quality. So some of the best metrics we have, though, are focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. So there we measure access to safely managed drinking water. And we know 5.8 billion people have access to safely managed drinking water. And so that's great. But we don't know how resilient those systems are. We don't have measures that can track that. The way we usually track it, especially in Africa and Asia, is through nationally representative surveys. So that once every 5 years, they will go around and they will survey what levels of access people have to water systems. And that can help us understand a certain level of their access, but it's not getting at these issues of variability, and it's not addressing those underlying issues related to climate resilience. And Seifu highlighted some of those in his presentation by looking at those different levels of functionality. And that's the kind of information we need to understand climate resilience, as to whether it is functioning all year round and accessible. But I wanted to highlight 3 particular points on what we need to consider in those climate resilience metrics for drinking water systems. So the first part is the infrastructure. So we know infrastructure is important. We know, for example, these deep groundwater systems that Seifu's highlighted are more reliable, more resilient to weather fluctuations. And so there'll be more, hopefully they'll give access to more reliable water sources. But what they don't necessarily provide in terms of resilience is quality. They can provide better resilience, but we still see it as a challenge in terms of providing that resilience. So in the developed world, in Europe, we still see that we get outbreaks associated with drinking water in heavy rainfall events, for example. And so you'll see that link between climate and water quality and health. In Bangladesh, in some of the work we've done, we've seen that water sources that people are using, which would be considered improved, these are good water sources, tube wells or piped water systems, twice as many are contaminated in the wet season as in the dry season. So there's a huge difference in the quality of drinking water that people have access to, even perhaps if they're considered to have access to safely managed drinking water in that survey. And then thirdly, one of the issues is behaviour. Do people actually use these drinking water sources? And so we've seen from across our research that while people may have access in the dry season, they may be using these more resilient sources and using groundwater sources, but these are not necessarily their preferred source. So they're not necessarily the most affordable, the most convenient, or the best tasting. So I think with issues of salinity being one of the issues that Salaheen's highlighted. So what we find is that when surface waters and rainwater become available, people are switching their water source. And that has implications for the health, but it also has implications for the financial stability of those systems. If people aren't paying for that water all year round, it makes it very hard to manage it financially as well. And so we need to consider those 3 aspects when we're thinking about climate resilience. And so if we don't, at the moment, we don't have the metrics to track that. We don't have metrics that allow us to track this internationally and to look at which systems are vulnerable to climate, which systems are, their performance is varying with climate, but also it means we don't have the metrics to track which ones have good climate resilience, where are our successes, so we can identify them and learn from them and improve climate resilience more broadly.
improvement of those metrics would further our understanding of the complex influence of climate on water security. And I guess picking up on the points that both Ellen and Katrina have made, we need to take the information that is generated by this research and apply it to developing these institutional models that can help maintain water supply into the future when we're faced with climate change risks and also existing risks. And I guess I'd like to pick up on the third point, which is improving those institutional models. And Reach has done quite a lot of good work developing new models that help to provide sustainable rural water services for rural regions in both Bangladesh and Kenya. So I'm talking about Safe Pani, which is a project in Bangladesh, and also Fundy Fix, which is based in Kenya. And these models are developed to supply water when the water services would typically run dry, so during droughts and also periods when there's high water quality issues. These models are aimed at sustaining water in the most highest risk, both temporal and spatial events. Likewise, we're working to try and improve water services during infrastructure failure. So as Katrina mentioned, in these extreme climate events, so in flooding, for instance, in Bangladesh, water infrastructure can often fail. And what we found is that regular maintenance, so ensuring that these water supply points are maintained throughout the year, throughout the seasons, is one way to reduce the downtime and ensure that water is running through the most extreme climate events. And then likewise, I'm talking specifically now about the existing climate risks, but we know, based on the presentations we've seen, that climate change is likely to increase the risk from climate on water supplies. And so several projects led by Reach have looked at planning for future climate risks, in particular using CMIP5 outputs. So from our climate models, we've been able to run specific water system models and look at different future scenarios and plan for uncertainties in climate and both climate, demand and policy uncertainties. And so there's a wide range of using the information generated by these projects to try and plan for future risks. And so I think that covers our 3 recommendations. We'd like to open the floor to questions now. Hopefully we'd like questions in person. We also have questions being submitted online. So if you do have a question, we have a microphone. So please raise your hand and Saskia will bring the microphone to you. Otherwise, we can go to online questions if there are any yet.
Not yet.
Any from the audience? Yes, please.
My question is just about one particular type of institutional model. In this past summer, the World Bank published quite a few papers on the promise of public-private sector partnerships as it relates to sanitation specifically, not so much this aspect of water. I'm just curious about, when speaking about water and its relation to climate change specifically, if your research yielded anything in particular that is unique about the promise of public-private sector partnerships, if there even is any, and just what are some, I think, unique aspects of that when we're speaking about climate change and how we involve private sector actors, given that they also cause many of these problems and are exacerbating many of these issues as well in these regions.
Great. Katrina, would you like to comment on that?
Okay. So I think we don't have a particular example to draw of that, but what we do see is that there certainly is a role for the private sector. So one of the things we work on with our institutional models is the professional service providers for drinking water supplies. So having someone who comes in and is trained and is financed to provide that service. So that can be someone who's in government, it can be someone from fully public, or it can be private. And so there's different models that we explore with that. But it's more that you have it's changing that role so you've got someone who can act on data, and certainly someone who can act on climate data. So for example, in Bangladesh, we've been working in, as Anna highlighted, in the coastal areas where we have where we've seen water supplies which are damaged in cyclones, and then it takes 9 months for them to be repaired. So giving someone, bringing in a professional service provider gives us the opportunity to give someone that responsibility to make that change. But also what we're hoping to do is to pair them up to make sure they've got access to that climate information so that they can see, okay, this is going to keep happening. How do we change this system so that we're more resilient to those climate shocks that are going to come through, rather than just repairing the same system over and over again? So it's not really necessarily has to be public or private, but very much making those roles which are dependent on the local context for what works for that country.
And then on the uptake of climate information and communicating to private corporations, if you've come across that in any of your work.
Yeah, we don't really talk a lot about uptake with private corporations, but I think maybe in Ethiopia and the Awash Basin, this will become more important as there's kind of a push to industrialize the basin a little bit more. So the users of information will become sort of a different group of people, and they'll have different water needs and also probably have different sensitivities to risk. And so, for example, the group that would be providing information right now would be the National Met Authority in Ethiopia, and they will have to become sort of more flexible in how they provide this information, because right now, from our work, we know that it's quite a rigid system with a sort of a set of parameters that are sort of shared every time. So every time they do one of these climate outlook forums, which is how they share the information. So I think that this will kind of change the playing field that they will have to deal with in providing climate information, and they might have very different interactions with the private sector than they do with, for example, small-scale irrigators or water managers right now.
Are there any questions online? Yes, please.
There is one from online. Is are the groundwater aquifers, especially in Africa, a renewable resource?
Is that are the groundwater aquifers a renewable resource?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Seifu couldn't stay online, unfortunately. So that's why we had the recording. But certainly the work he's been leading in Ethiopia has been focused on trying to understand the recharge of the aquifers, to understand which ones are renewable and which ones are more fossil aquifers, or being recharged so slowly that they're being over abstracted. And so certainly we're seeing big differences across those basins. Those very arid areas that he highlighted, groundwater is being recharged, but it's being recharged from a long distance away. These are regional aquifers, and so it's very complex to understand that level of recharge that's going into them, because it's being transported for hundreds of kilometers before it's being abstracted. Whereas some of the work we've been doing on the shallow aquifers, certainly around Addis, we're seeing that while these are recharged, they're recharged from the local rainfall, but the abstraction rates are so high that these are now, the groundwater levels going down, which has implications for the existing infrastructure. It has implications for water security in that area. But interestingly, then that groundwater is then discharged to the river, and so it's also changing the river flows as well. So it's a complex question as to whether which ones are renewable or not. Certainly the ones in Lodwar, so Lodwar, where Marina was talking about, they identified a deep groundwater resource 5 or so years ago, which was identified through remote sensing technologies and some other modeling. But those ones have, those are not eventuating with the promise of water that was initially projected for those, unfortunately. So those ones are, there are issues of salinity, there are issues of being able to access that water still. It's not enough that that water is there, but it's the challenge of trying to access it.
And just to add to that, understanding those complex relationships between surface water and groundwater are key, specifically as Katrina mentioned in the Awash and for Addis. So some of the modelling work led by REACH has shown that in order to force sustainable water use or maintain water use into the future, we need to have more of a conjunctive use of both groundwater and surface water at the same time. Because if not, if there's too much of a dependence on groundwater, we do risk running those aquifers dry. So, and that was achieved through understanding that was achieved through scenario modelling. So, we are exploring how renewable groundwater sources are, but as Katrina said, they're so complex and they vary so much on spatial scales that there's a lot of work to be done. Are there any more questions in the room? Yes, please. Do you want to wait till you get the microphone, just so our online audience can hear as well? Thank you.
Katrina, you mentioned that we don't currently have the metrics to track which drinking water systems are working and which aren't. Why is that? Is there a reason for that? And is that something that REACH would look into or is able to look into developing?
So there is certainly something we're very interested in. One of the reasons there aren't the metrics is because of those complexities I highlighted, that we have a lot of information on the infrastructure. We're starting to get more information on quality and reliability, but it's not seasonal. It's not being able to track that, that relationship to weather. And it's partly just that you need such a, you need a way of gauging data over a longer period. And so some ways that this is done, certainly within the Sustainable Development Goals, you have questions which are related to food security, for example, where they're asking the respondent to comment on food security over the past year. So that gets you some of that variability in theory, but you can't break it down. We are looking at ways where we can better understand that with water. So it's very difficult because you still have to ask that question going, have you had enough water, say, for the whole year? And you need to then drill down and work out what might be the cause of that. Because you know, with water, there's so many more causes than just climate. There's all the interaction with urbanization and demand and pollution issues as well. So we are looking at it, and we have a program that's progressing this in Ethiopia, where we're working at scale across the Awash Basin, trying to understand people's experiences of water security, and through that trying to get those metrics, look at what those metrics might be for climate resilience. And we're working with the Household Water Insecurity Experiences Network, HWISE, on that, and looking at how you can use some of their experiential metrics on a seasonal basis. But that would still mean regular data collection, and so there's still issues then about how do you streamline that data collection. Can you use mobile phone technology? Can you use different ways to collect information to capture some more of that seasonal risk? Do we have Dan? Okay, so maybe that should be the last question.
The end users of the climate information are also the communities or the local people. If they are, was the project able to tailor the information or put the information in a format that the local people were able to understand what the climate information was trying to explain?
Ellen, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so we've been we don't provide a lot of climate information at the local level, but we are trying to understand how the local institutions do provide information at the local level and potentially try to kind of offer some recommendations or lessons from different places. So we're looking in the Turkwa River Basin in Kenya and also the Awash Basin in Ethiopia. And I don't know, Penny, if you want to take this question after me. Yeah, just to try and understand what information a Met service is going to kind of give out at the national level to different institutions, to the county level, the regional level, and then what ends up trickling down to the community level. And the important thing that we've kind of found and that we think is something that needs to be reinforced is that there are boundary institutions that kind of provide this useful link. So they're both users of information and creators of information, and they transform the information that a meteorologist will create to something that is more useful to people at the community level. But they also incorporate other types of climate information that aren't necessarily made by meteorologists. So it's those groups and people are quite important to actually creating information that's useful. And the other thing that we think is quite important, which isn't always in place, is feedback mechanisms. So we're very interested in whether people feel like they have a way to feedback about the information that they've received, or whether they feel like they have the tools to kind of talk to the person who's given them that information, or whether it comes to them on the radio or in a text or something, if there's actually some way for them to say, this is never useful. I need to know when the rainy season begins rather than a seasonal average or something like that. So the feedback mechanisms are really important, and what people understand as feedback seems to really vary depending on whether you are someone who is sort of like an end user of climate information or someone who is producing climate information. The word means very different things, so there's a bit of a disconnect there. I don't know if Penny's really like an expert on this, so.
And I only want to add one more thing. So in the local level, there's also like the local community, for example, the indigenous community, they have their own way of focusing, and then they have their own way of knowing the weather systems. So sometimes there's like a conflicted situations when the information is coming from the Met office or like from the kind of like formal channel, but like the local people don't want to use it because they have their own way of kind of predicting the seasonal forecast or like what is going to happen in the coming year. So there's always like this conflicting issues. But like now, for example, in Kenya, what they're trying to do is like trying to have this hybrid system, which is they also use this elders predictions, the indigenous prediction, and also trying to project it to the kind of like meteorological department projections, and then make decisions out of it. So yeah, there are those kind of local way of getting those information as well. So one of the things that the national government is give me in my project is that they need to understand more on this indigenous way of prediction and also the forecasting in the management system as well.
Great, thank you. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to ask our panelists one final question. If you could give me your key points take away from the report and summarize that in a minute or less, if possible. I'll start with Katrina.
Okay, so for me, it's about these complex and indirect pathways. So particularly the pollution example from Bangladesh, for example. If we get water security right, if we manage to address this, we won't hopefully notice the impacts of climate anywhere near as much. The industrial development that we're seeing in many countries, and this is something that Marina and I are working on in Ethiopia as well with the African Governance Program at Oxford Martin School, that these are having a huge burden on our waterways. Climate change is going to make that so much more of an issue. There's a potential for that pollution to push us over thresholds in those ecosystems, and we're seeing big interventions needed to mitigate this. So in Dhaka, they've had to move their drinking water offtake tens of kilometers. So there's huge additional pumping costs. They have to change rivers to get away from that pollution already. And that's just going to get worse as those dry periods get worse. So I think those kind of more indirect, more subtle ways that that we see water security and climate resilience being related, that for me has been one of the really exciting things to come that came out of the report.
Great, thank you. Ellen.
For me, it's again all about communication. Climate communication is hard because it requires people from different sectors and different disciplines to kind of try and speak the same language, whatever that is, when using information. But it's very worthwhile because it's what gives us the flexibility to sort of figure out do we have the information to answer that question? Do we need to change the question a little bit so that we actually can use some information to help sort of understand the problem? And I mean, there's so many different types of climate information, and there's so many different sort of uses for it. It's really helpful if we can actually sort of talk about how we can be a bit more flexible in how we do it. And I think the thing is, I think by having better communication, and this requires effort from both creators and users and understanding what those two words actually mean. You don't have to see, not every problem is a nail, and we don't have to be kind of coming around with a hammer to try and solve all of those problems. So yeah, communication is really sort of how we were able to do some of the different projects that are in this report, sort of looking across different sectors and then saying, oh yes, this is a problem we could apply some climate information to get a bit more context about how this might change in the future. So that's sort of the takeaway for me.
Thank you. If you wouldn't mind thanking our panelists. So we have, I think, Daniel on the line, who's going to provide some reflections on the report.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent.
He's a strategic analyst in climate, water, energy and growth, and has worked as a water security and climate change policy analyst for WaterAid. He's also advised the Ethiopian Ministry of Water, Irrigation and Electricity on the financing and delivery of climate resilient growth. So Dan, over to you.
You've created my nightmare scenario where I've been looking at that massive screen and I realise I'm now Big Brother-esque huge head on that screen. So sorry about that. Thank you all very much for the insights and the huge amount of work that's gone into this report specifically, but the underlying research that's happened in the last 6 years for REACH. I've been involved with REACH for quite some time, and continues to be one of my favourite research programs that I've ever been had the privilege to work with. The title of this launch, this event, is about how can research support action for COP and beyond. So I'm going to start off by completely dismissing COP, really, because we love to focus on COP. We love the attention and the excitement and the sort of sexiness of it, and it brings a huge amount of kind of froth that goes around it. And having been involved in a fair few of them, you know, COP itself, it's in the UNFCCC. COP is a regular moment. It's a technical negotiation, really, and I think and a lot of expectations on this one event that is going to fix everything. And we need to recognise that the international negotiations are an important part of the process, but they're not where change is going to happen. And so I think we risk wasting a lot of our energy and resources by focusing solely on COP. It is important, but it's insufficient to really change what needs to happen. So what really matters most, and what I kind of want to focus minds on a little bit, and I hope if you sort of reframe thinking about international climate change in this way, which is that what matters most is what happens at a national and a subnational level, and that's much harder. And as several other people have said today, you know, the issues we're talking about here, kind of security and climate resilience, are very context specific. They're very locally specific, and a lot of the work on climate, whether that's the climate science or whether that's impact or whatever, tends to happen and be analysed at this more generalised global scale. And Ellen was referring to some of that. So there's a real need to kind of drill down and understand that at the local kind of context. And there's a lot of analysis out there, and there's a lot of high-level advocacy that we should do this, we should do that. And what I think is really important, and the role that research has to play, is around really providing that evidence, and this challenge of communicating it, to walk this fine line between not oversimplifying it and not getting lost in reams of complexity. We know that water and climate are intricately linked. We know that they affect you, but we need to get into the detail and what are we going to do about that. And often when we get to that level, we then get lost in too much of the detail. So I think that's a real challenge between the two. And I think what matters with research is really quality. A lot of reports out there will say that they're research reports, but actually quality, robust research that is peer reviewed, that has been through a rigorous process, is really, really important. So quality, I think, is a really critical aspect, and one that I think we should never overlook, really. So that I think there's three areas where I see that this research, in particular, but research and research can play a role, and which is firstly surfacing context-specific issues, as I've said about, particularly where things are non-intuitive, where they're counterintuitive, where there's an opportunity to challenge perceptions and assumptions, and where there's to raise and identify where there's trade-offs and there's opportunities, so that the evidence base around climate change isn't just driven by advocacy and sort of high-level campaigning messaging based on kind of what's really going on, what matters most. That's far from easy to discern in the kind of volume out there. The second around helping better decision making, which is really about that piece around cutting through some of the sort of skewed, I guess, or biased advocacy that can be out there, and also misperceptions. I think it's important that we take a broad sweep of understanding what is happening at what science is telling us, what people are telling us on the grounds, but also looking at and identifying where there's misperceptions and where things don't line up, and challenging any assumptions and that underpin that. I think Ellen's points around communication and translation, I think, are critical in that, and the waiting to develop, just collectively decide actions, I think, is quite important. And also in terms of helping make better decisions, I think there's an important role around supporting or developing decision support tools, which is one way of helping translate complexity by effectively sort of black boxing it or abstracting it in kind of coding terms, so that it's more usable to people who are using the end results. So surfacing context-specific information, helping better decision making, and finally figuring out what works, really. And so Katrina talks about metrics, and I think metrics is a part of that. But there's a bigger question here of like, well, what is going to make a difference? What works? What has been working so far? What's not been working? And where are there new ways of doing things? And for me, that's what this point around institutional models is about. It's not just about institutions, it's just about how do we do things and how do we do things better. So that's it. That's it for me. I think the key things are what really matters if you're looking and thinking about action is how do you support, how does research support action to be taken at a national and a subnational level? And I think there's really three critical roles: surfacing context-specific issues, helping make better decisions, and figuring out what works.
That concludes our seminar on this water security report. If you do have any questions, feel free to email them over to us. And I'd like to just give a final thank you to the Oxford Martin School for helping us set up this hybrid event. I think technical difficulties aside, it's been a success. So thank you very much, everybody.